Ella, maybe could you add on the death list, David Durant, Durant, David
Illness or death?
Death. Yeah,
Word.
David
David Durant.
Durant. Yes, thanks. All right, let's go ahead and start tonight. Welcome, everyone. This is again our second class in this series. Let's do some prayers. Jana, are you all set to lead those? Great. We'll let Jana do that. Let me move this stuff out of the way, though, so it's not so kind of in the way. All right.
Praise to Shakyamuni Buddha, 3 times in English. To the founder,
The endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge.
To the founder,
The endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge.
short mandala offering 1 time in Tibetan. Sajipo
Chukchen me Amri Rabbe Chi Nide Gyan Padi Sangye Jindu Mitte Doku Mandak Jingma Choparsho Guru Ratna Mandala Kamiryatayami.
Refuge in Bodhicitta, once in English, twice in Tibetan. I
Go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings.
Sangye
Chodam Soki Choknam La Yangchu Bardu Dakni Kyapsu Chi Daki Chunyan Gi Pe Sonam Gi Yola Penchir Sangye Druparsho Sangye Chodam Soki Choknam La Yangchu Bardu Dakni Kyapsu Chi Daki Chunyan Gi Pe Sonam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Druparsho. Great, thank you, Jana. Thank you all. Let's do a short meditation before we begin. Again, this is just a chance for us to focus the mind a bit, let go of whatever distractions we might have from our day, and then to set our motivation together, this motivation of bodhicitta. So to spend the first few minutes focusing on the breath, whatever technique you tend to use with the breath, you can do that now. We'll do that in silence, just trying to hold our awareness with the breath. Whenever the mind wanders, then guiding the mind gently back to the breath. So we'll begin now, and then again, I'll come in just a few minutes to set our motivation. So now to set our motivation for tonight's class, just want to invite you to think about how anger manifests in our world. Last week, we spoke about the disadvantages of anger for ourselves, but we can also apply it to our world and see the discord, the disharmony, the division that exists because of anger or that accompanies our anger. And just to become aware of it. And certainly, anger has made its way into our political arena, where it's always played a role, but also into the social networks that we have. families, workplaces. Well, while we are thinking about that, it's important to also remember those forces that are working for the betterment of our society. Those beings who are dedicated to being more patient, to diminishing their own anger, to doing what they can to create communities of harmony and to avoid the discord, the divisiveness. And just by being here, we become a part of that community, dedicating our time, our energy to learning how to work with our own minds, to lessen our own anger, to be able to skillfully work with others and be in the world with a mind that is more tolerant and patient, and that is striving towards the betterment of all beings. So when we set our motivation in a way, we're rededicating ourselves to being on that side of the fence, to say, yes, we are going to make a difference in the world through our controlling our own minds much better. We can become an influence in a positive way on others, and certainly cease harming them, making their minds disturbed, but eventually being able to guide them very skillfully to becoming patient, loving, kind beings themselves. So this is our motivation of bodhicitta in essence. We always come with the idea of working on ourselves, improving our own qualities, reducing our own negative tendencies, so we can then benefit other beings and lead them to achieving the same state that we are striving for, our own enlightenment, and the enlightenment, therefore, of all sentient beings. All right, so in the last class, which again was the first in this series of 4 that we're doing in this month of April, I introduced this whole idea of what we're trying to accomplish in this course, which is essentially to look at this mind of anger. We spent a bit of time examining it. By the way, there are a number of handouts that they've been sending out with the weekly notices. If you aren't on the email list for the center, you might want to sign up just to have those. This is the most of what we covered last week, but we covered this entire first topic, investigating anger and patience, going into what the nature of those two states of mind are, talking a little bit about the mind in Buddhism, which I also spoke about in the one-off talk I did 2 weeks ago. But then what are the factors that cause anger to arise? And so all of these, again, I have some readings I put together, very short readings that are also out there. And these are important topics to kind of understand the nature of what we're referring to here. Recall that when we talk about anger, we are talking about the deluded state of mind, the afflicted state of mind. We're not talking about what His Holiness would often call a sort of justifiable anger at what's going on in our world, that where you have compassion for beings. But we have to, of course, have our compassion complete. We can't have compassion only for those that are in the role of the victim in this life and not have compassion for the perpetrators. We have to have a compassion that is all-encompassing. But he feels that the word anger and at times could refer to that motivating factor that allows us to go to protests and to be involved in things that are about making sure that that voice of compassion and love and kindness in our world is not lost. So by no means are we talking about excluding any of that expression of our concern for the suffering of the world. Anger here is a delusion where we are looking at something that is negative that is happening to us. Remember, we went into the 2 arrows based on the Salata Sutra and the Pali Canon. The very first arrow is something that happens to us, which is the ripening of our own past karma. We're going to examine this a little bit, I think, in next week's teachings, where we talk about the karmic angle on all of it. But this is a key part of it. Whatever comes into our life, we've created the causes for that. And this is kind of life giving us the lessons we need to learn on the basis of what is manifesting. So then we oftentimes do the second arrow. We have that painful experience. It's a ripening of our own past karma. It's often physical, though it can even be just mental. But then we add on to that through all the mental hijinks that we do by, increasing our thoughts of animosity or, how we can't stand what's going on or how we blame other people for what's happening. And this is the mind of anger. The mind of anger develops often on the basis of those first arrow experiences. But the second arrow, that what we do with our conceptual mind, is something we can control. We can't control the first arrow right now. First arrow, things are going to happen to you. You're in samsara. You're going to experience a variety of sufferings. Everything's not going to go the way you want it to. You're going to have to meet unpleasant things in this life. That's the first arrow. What we do in the second arrow is entirely optional. And that's causing us more torment, causing us greater suffering. So again, what's happening essentially, and I did want to pull up a little file here where I've got just a couple of additional quotes that aren't in the readings, but essentially we have, let's see if I can find that real quick. Finding calm in the storm. There we go. We have this feeling of mental unhappiness that is occurring. Okay. And what's happening with mental unhappiness? Of course, we have the physical unhappiness often of, again, not getting what we want, having things. Oops, was it that's the clock? Okay. Nothing too important in some ways. I do need to know what time it is eventually, but so again, we have something that is happening that's bringing us maybe a level of physical unhappiness or physical discomfort. I use the example of somebody outside or wherever you live playing really, really loud music that you don't like. So you have that unpleasant experience of hearing that music. That again is inducing additional mental unhappiness. The physical unhappiness is simply the abrasive sound of that against your eardrum. I mean, that's really all that's going on is molecules moving in the air that are causing you to have that experience of that loud music. Your whole story you tell about that is the mental unhappiness that you're generating on the basis of that. And this is what feeds our mind of anger. There's a wonderful quote from Master Shantideva, who I quoted last week as well. I have to go forward here a little bit, but not too far because I don't have too many. There we go. Let me go ahead and put this slideshow on so we can go to the first slide within this for tonight. Having found its fuel of mental unhappiness in the prevention of what I wish for and in doing what I do not want, hatred increases and then destroys me. He uses the word hatred here, but hatred, anger, all of these are in the same continuum. Everything from minor irritation or annoyances all the way up to full-fledged rage, or hatred. Again, its fuel is mental unhappiness. It's a mental unhappiness that we keep recycling, ruminating about, and increasing the power of until we have an episode of anger in its full-fledged form. But then, of course, often doing things that we regret later because of things we say or do to others, who are we see as the causes of that, right? The person who's playing the music. We don't see again that we're necessarily even involved in it karmically. So this is how hatred increases and destroys us. So Master Shantideva says, therefore, I should totally eradicate the fuel of this enemy, which essentially means getting rid of the mental unhappiness, which is that second arrow. I wanted to point this out with this verse because I think it's a powerful statement as to what we are trying to address. The first arrow stuff you can get rid of eventually over time. When you are free from samsara and you no longer have to experience the ripening of that karma, you won't have to experience that. But the reality is for most of us, we're not there yet, so we are going to continue to have that first arrow stuff. This mental unhappiness that gets generated and gets strengthened through the force of these thoughts becomes the source of our anger. So it says then in the last two lines, for this enemy of mental unhappiness has no other function than that of causing me harm. This process that we get involved in of just exacerbating our own suffering through the force of our own minds. And of course, this is good Buddhist psychology, essentially, is to be attentive to our minds and to be able to address what's going on. That's what this whole course is about. So if we go back then to the outline of the course, and I'll share a little bit more on this. The first thing we looked at just the first topic within this first level of practice. This is kind of how I divided it up. And by this, I don't mean that you shouldn't try the third or the fourth level without trying the first or the second. But nonetheless, for most of us, it helps to start at the very more basic practices and work our way up to, of course, the final one deals with, applying the wisdom of emptiness, which of course is a much more complicated teaching to bring to bear on our moments of anger. But this first level of practice, I'm sorry, John, is it
What I have on my phone is different.
different than what? Well, you know, it did this last week. I think what I have to do, sorry, I have to do this. For some reason, it keeps resetting this, my screen setting. It, instead of duplicating, it extends. Let me make sure that that took okay. I think it should. Let me put it up there. Thank you for letting me know that, John. I just have to remember to do this when I come up here all the time. Is it now showing
Yes.
the outline on the screen? Okay. So the very first topic we looked at last week that can be a first kind of technique right out the door to practice is to recall the disadvantages of anger. Again, I didn't teach so much on that because the writings that I put together for it highlight a number of disadvantages. We see the disadvantages physically, you know, from anger. We see the disadvantages, of course, mentally and the patterns that we get involved in and the discord that can arise from the basis of it. This is what I was having you meditate on in the meditation tonight. See how anger plays such a strong role in creating so much conflict in our world. So when we initially see those disadvantages, sometimes that's enough to quench our anger right from the beginning, right? To say, okay, you know, I see that where this is going. I've been on that train before. I know the destination. I don't need to go there again because, again, I'm only going to be harming myself and others. What I want to pick up on tonight is the next two bullet points, the role of meditation and mindfulness in applying these techniques. And again, I could have put that before the first one, but nonetheless, I want to always make sure I at least cover one technique to work with. And I did that last week, but at least looking at the disadvantages of anger. And then also looking at this technique of observing anger, just being kind of having a more subjective awareness of what's going on. I'm sorry, an objective awareness of what's going on subjectively in our minds so that we don't get identifying with that anger and, of course, exacerbating it and strengthening it. So again, for each of these, by the way, I have put together a little practice. We have practice 1 and practice 2 for last week. Practice 1 was that kind of 2 arrows thing. And then practice 2 was looking at these disadvantages. So I will go through practice 3 once we go through the respective teachings on this. So let me go forward just a few pages. Sorry if that's making anyone dizzy. Not quite, oh, I'm sorry, I went too far, I think. Yeah, because I'm already in teachings that I want to be going through tonight. Oh, there it is. Okay, so this is the second part of this, again, this bullet point having to do with the first level of practice. Regarding the role of meditation and mindfulness in applying these techniques. Again, I'm not going to always read everything in here, but I'm using this as a starting point. These are some quotes from the book I mentioned last week that's really a wonderful kind of supplement to this course, Working with Anger by Venerable Thupten Chodron. She says in that, the general strategy for working with anger is first, to learn and correctly understand the techniques, which again is what I'm emphasizing in these various levels of practice, which often involve what we call reframing a situation so that we view it from a different perspective, a new perspective. His Holiness often emphasizes this in his teachings as well. We have a more habitual perspectives that we tend to fall into. And of course, the mind of anger is essentially a perspective. It is a conceptual way of framing what's going on that we have simply become very familiar with. And that's why anger arises more, strongly and repeatedly than does the mind of compassion or love or what have you in those moments. So we have to change our story, essentially. We have to change our perspective. But just by doing that, of course, we have the ability to lessen our anger, to not have that arise, and of course, to create more positive states of mind in its place. So again, that's the whole point, is to reframe it and then have that new perspective. He says, she says, then we begin to practice these techniques in the peaceful environment of a meditation session or reflection time. This familiarizes our mind with and increases our confidence in a repertoire of alternative ways to look at situations that used to make us angry. And I don't like this phrase, make us angry, because again, it's a little identification of anger with ourselves. It used to, cause anger to arise. I'm not pointing out any faults in Venerable Chodron. She's a wonderful teacher. It's just that's my own preference around not using the word angry so much as having anger. So training ourselves in these techniques, it says, when we are not upset or in a tense situation is important. And this is really, again, why I'm presenting it in this way, is kind of going through one or two, sometimes a few more techniques each week, is to give you an opportunity then to work with these in meditation and then hopefully try them out in your daily life. But if you simply come and you go, oh, those kind of interesting, and then you think you're going to be able to apply them, well, we all know that we need time on the cushion to become familiar with these. That's really what the Tibetan word gom for meditation, we call this a gompa, place of meditation. It means to become familiar with. What we are trying to become familiar with are these different perspectives, these new perspectives, so that when we get up off the cushion and we're going about our daily life, we can bring them to mind and have a reduction, hopefully, in the mind of anger and a little bit more patience. And again, perhaps some more positive thoughts that will also be a part of this. So the whole thing is to be in kind of a safe environment to practice these. Because in the moment, as we talked about last week, especially what happens physically with us when we're in a tense situation, it's very hard to communicate well or to even think well because the mind has already begun to get very irritated and agitated, and we just don't have that composure. So sit in quiet meditation. You don't have to do it in a formal meditation session, but you at least sit quietly somewhere and really think through these techniques. Again, I've given you a little bit of readings on each of these. You can review, what I said as well as what Venerable Children and others who I'm citing have said about those topics, and then reflect on them to try to bring them more deeply into your mind. Recall that in Tibetan Buddhism, we present essentially two main types of meditation. The first is what we did at the beginning of tonight, stabilizing meditation, we call it, or placement meditation, where we focus on a single object, such as the breath. The breath is a really good one to use because it's there all the time. We don't have to contrive it. So essentially, you bring the mind to a little bit more single pointed focus. That's the initial phase of our meditation. And then we introduce what we call analytical meditation. Analytical meditation is just what we normally call thinking. We already have really good analytical meditation in regard to the mind of anger because we look at that person who's doing something offensive and we start, reinforcing that through ruminating on it, strengthening, exaggerating the unpleasant qualities of that, and so on. That's an analytical meditation. It's just not a very helpful one, right? It's not the one we want to be doing. Instead, on our cushion, we want to start analyzing that situation from the point of view of these different perspectives and say, okay, how does it feel to look at it this way? How does it feel to use a technique in this manner? And then we gain some familiarity with it in that safe environment of our meditation session, rather than being on the spot and having to practice it immediately on not having done any reflection on it. Now, we still might not have such good success in bringing it to bear in our daily life, but that's where we go into meditation again later in that day, that evening, if we have time. We reflect on that scenario once more because we want to bring that scenario into our mind so that we have kind of the raw stuff to work from. The feeling of what it was like when that person did that or said that, the feelings that were arising. Use that as our kind of workshop for strengthening these alternative ways of looking at things, working with things. That's essentially what she's going into in this whole section. And that's, again, totally Buddhist practice. It's also certainly, I don't think, Western psychology is, they do have this certainly as part of cognitive behavioral therapy and what have you, but it's not necessarily the techniques that are used as frequently there as they are in Buddhism. So maybe again in that second paragraph, while sitting quietly, we first remember a situation in which we exploded in anger or an event that brings back feelings of hurt or hostility, and then we apply the techniques to it. So again, with regard to the first technique that we looked at last week, essentially, which was to see the disadvantages of anger, well, what would it be like to be able to bring those to mind at that moment when we were in that situation again? So we recall, oh, earlier today when this happened, what would it be like if I actually thought about the disadvantages of anger in that moment? Would that curtail the thoughts of anger arising? And sometimes, again, it does. Just having that is enough, especially with things that are maybe not so huge, little irritations that we have on, hearing somebody's thoughts or, what they're talking about on the internet or what have you. I mean, that might be able to be triggering in a little way, but not in a huge way. So we are able to bring something like an antidote of seeing the disadvantages and apply it really quite quickly and easily. We have to practice in that manner so that we actually can apply it when we get to the actual situation. So in that next paragraph, she says, one key to applying the various techniques is to focus on our mental attitude and emotions, not on what to say or do. She makes this, it's a very good point. She says, in our American fix-it culture, when we have a conflict, it's all too easy to think, what should I do? We instantly want to fix the problem by changing factors in the external situation. This tendency, she says, comes from the ingrained view that the problem exists outside, independent of us. However, as discussed before, since the problem begins with the way our mind interprets and reacts to the situation, the solution begins inside our mind as well. Therefore, instead of going around in circles trying to decide what to do, for the time being, we should shelve the urgency to fix the problem and focus on transforming our emotions and attitudes. Once that is done, what to say or do is not so difficult to decide. Now, again, it's not to say that we always have that time. We can't make generalizations about every situation we're going to be in. There might be a situation where something is happening very quickly and we might need to act. We do our best then to act as compassionately and caringly as we can and not out of a mind of anger. But if we do have the leisure to be able to look inside and see what's going on and become aware of our emotions and actually be somewhat more present with everything that is happening, then I think we will have a greater chance of coming up with a solution to the problem that is much more grounded in wisdom and compassion and other amazing qualities rather than potentially being, rooted in our anger. So I think it is important that we have that understanding that the tendency to act can sometimes become a huge obstacle because we immediately want to get out there and fix everything. Now, recall I think I did mention this verse last week. No, no, maybe I didn't get to that yet. We're going to get to that, I think, later tonight. There's that verse from Master Shantideva where he talks about, if you can fix something, well, then don't get worried or stressed out or angry, actually go fix it. There is something to be said for that. We do have some situations where something very small that could be fixed quite easily simply by changing the external. But the more important thing is to change the internal, to really look at how can I actually change my mind so that I make sure that whatever I do in terms of my response to that is also informed again by greater wisdom, greater compassion, is not actually coming out of a mind of anger. So that's the technique that is essentially, or the advice for working with these techniques. It's given by Venerable Chodron. There's an interesting book called All the Rage. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it. I haven't read it from cover to cover. I've read a number of articles in it. There's a beautiful piece by Thich Nhat Hanh called Sowing the Seeds of Love. And he says, one wonderful seed in our consciousness, the seed of mindfulness, when manifested, has the capacity of being aware of what is happening in the present moment. Why I'm presenting mindfulness together with this idea of meditation is because, of course, we generate mindfulness in meditation. It's one of the important skills that we need to have, one of the factors in our mind that allows us to be with the meditation process, to be with the single-pointed meditation, that stabilizing meditation that I mentioned that we start with, as well as to be focused on what we are investigating in terms of our analytical meditation. Of course, I might mention that these two are meant to be used in tandem. We might start with diminishing some of the distractedness in the mind and then doing the analysis. When we get to a conclusion from the analysis where we're really kind of hitting home, really kind of getting the point of that, then we go back to stabilizing, but we focus on that conclusion rather than the breath or some other object. And then when that begins to wane, we go back to the analysis to get back to that place. And we'll see this coming up more when we actually work with the techniques. But every one of these techniques is to try to make more firm and solid, a more virtuous and positive state of mind that we can then bring to mind in our daily life. Mindfulness is the factor that kind of connects those two things. Mindfulness of what we are meditating on and the conclusion we are arriving at, that then we need to be mindfully aware of in terms of applying it. But also, mindfulness is developed so that we can be attentive to what is happening in the present moment. And if you don't have any mindfulness, it's really hard to see what's going on in your own mind. You have to be able to be aware of that. Mindfulness gets used in a variety of ways in different Buddhist traditions. And again, in the way we present it in terms of meditative skill, it means to not forget what you are meditating on, not forget that object that you're focusing on or the object that you're analyzing, so that you stay present with what is happening. But this idea of being present with, kind of having that awareness of what is happening, is a really important quality in our meditation on the cushion, but also, of course, in our daily life. Otherwise, we become mindless, right? Mindful, mindless. These are two opposing states. So we want to have a mindful awareness of what we are engaging in, what is happening, the thoughts that are arising. And Lama Yeshe used to talk about, this phrase of becoming your own therapist. Well, that's how you actually are able to do that. It requires kind of both things. It requires the familiarity with those antidotes, those different ways of thinking that we're going to apply, but it also requires our mindful presence with what is happening so we are able to identify what is going on and then, of course, bring into play different ways of looking at things. That's essentially the technique that is, when we add on what Thich Nhat Hanh is talking about, we end up with two very powerful tools, meditation and mindfulness. And they're not identical. Again, our meditation involves mindfulness, but our mindfulness is also something that we bring to bear throughout our daily life. And the power of our meditation can also, of course, be brought there. But our meditation time, in a sense, is a little bit separate from that. Thich Nhat Hanh goes on to say, when we first start to practice, our mindfulness will be weak, like a 15-watt light bulb. But as soon as we pay attention to our breathing, again, through a meditative practice, and of course, the other meditative practices that beyond just tending to the breath, it begins to grow stronger. And after practicing like that for a few weeks, it becomes as bright as a 100-watt bulb. With the light of mindfulness shining, we touch many wonderful elements within and around us. And while doing so, we water the seeds of peace, joy, and happiness in us. And at the same time, we refrain from watering the seeds of unhappiness. So really, that's the goal, as I've said previously, to diminish the tendency for the mental unhappiness and the causes that will lead us in that direction, exacerbating our own suffering through the mind of anger and so on, and accentuating all of the minds that lead to greater peace and well-being, and that cause us to be in harmony with others. So then he says, when we start out, the seeds of unhappiness in us are quite strong because we have been watering them every day. That's the goal, is to stop giving them water, stop, feeding those minds through our mental processes. When those seeds of unhappiness are strong, even if we do not invite them up from the basement, they will push the door open and barge into the living room. When they enter, it is not at all pleasant. We may try to suppress them and keep them in the basement, but because we have watered them so much, they are strong enough to just show up in the upper level of our consciousness, even without an invitation. This is his analogy for these things like our monsters in the basement or something, the seeds that grow from that. So he goes on to say then, while the pain is in the basement, you can enjoy many refreshing and healing elements of life by producing mindfulness. Then, when the pain wants to come upstairs, you can open the living room door and invite your pain to come up. You can smile at it and embrace it with your mindfulness, which has become strong. It's kind of like, welcome, old friend. It's good, not necessarily good to see you again, but I'm going to work with you. Invite it in. I was doing a talk on fear at Tupten Oberling last Sunday, and it's a similar approach to our fear. I mean, we have a tendency to kind of block fear and to be very resistant to so many of our negative emotions. But it's actually good to smile at them, to invite them in, to kind of say, okay, what do you have to teach me? Not that you want to have them like take over the household and become the whole, the whole experience. You want to kind of learn from them. Allow them to come in so you can see what they're about. And as we're saying, to introduce different ways of thinking and different ways of creating more positive aspects in our mind. So essentially, if we're going to, because I think it tends to be, if we're not doing that resistance thing, it tends to be even suppressing that we do often. I mentioned that last week, right? We suppress our anger, just keep stuffing it and stuffing it and stuffing it. And of course, what happens then? Over time, eventually it explodes, because that's impossible for us to kind of keep that energy contained. So don't keep pushing it in the basement. Get back in the basement. You bring it up, it's going to barge into the living room anyway. Well, just sit it down, serve it a cup of tea, say, okay, what do you have to teach me? That's an important part of the process too. And of course, that's done mindfully. It's done mindfully because we're not going to simply, again, let these minds of anger and unhappiness and what have you run the whole show. We're going to actually use them as a doorway for increasing our positive qualities. So in the center there, last quote from Thich Nhat Hanh from that article, practicing mindfulness helps us get strong enough to open the door to our living room and let the pain come up. every time our pain is immersed in mindfulness, it will lose some of its strength. And later, when it returns, it will be weaker. Again, he uses this term of pain, but I think we're talking about any of the more painful emotions that we would tend to generate, which anger and resentment and spite and so on are all in that category. So the more that we bring them up and actually work with them, don't suppress them, don't try to hide from them, and do so with mindfulness, again, with an awareness that I'm going to be attentive to this and see what's the kernel that I can find in there. Because everything is happening within the context of causes and conditions. We're going to see this coming up later tonight. Why is that particular thing arising? What are the causes of that? How can I undermine the causes of that, change things so that I'm not feeding it? I'm not, giving all this energy to my anger. So let me conclude this section. I don't think there's too much left in terms of this working with these two, meditation and mindfulness. And then I'll see if there are any questions or comments on that, because I think it is important. And then we'll get into the technique of observing our anger. I found this really interesting. There's this 6seconds.org website. I think actually Rachel Ryer found this for me. Used to be the spiritual program coordinator and occasional teacher at our center in Tipton Overling, and she's taught up here as well. The headline for this little thing was "Emotions are absorbed in the body in about 6 seconds." This is kind of the physical side of it, but it's interesting the conclusion they come to. Each burst of emotion chemicals, from the time it's produced in the hypothalamus to the time it's completely broken down and absorbed, lasts about 6 seconds. The physical process of what is released in the body on the basis of those emotions coming into play, right? Remember, there is a physical component to it, but it isn't purely physical. It is our mind that is involved in that as well. But what's interesting is how the degree to which they say our mind is involved, if it goes beyond the 6 seconds. They say there, if we're feeling something for longer than that, we are at some level choosing to recreate and refuel those feelings. Sometimes that's good. If the tiger is still chasing you, those fear chemicals are helping you save your life, right? So we're not saying that in all cases when there is a threat to our well-being that we should just forget the threat and not react in a proper way. But, as they say in the next sentence, sometimes it's not really useful. It's not really helping. Recognizing what emotion we are feeling, evaluating its purpose relative to our circumstances, and then deciding whether to recreate it is what emotional intelligence is all about. I can't say I'm that well versed in emotional intelligence. Daniel Goleman wrote one of the main books on this, but there are many people who, again, have taught on this idea that we need to be as aware and attuned to our emotions as we are to our intelligence that we normally refer to. We need to kind of have an emotional intelligence. And there are a variety of other intelligences that have been highlighted in the process of exposing the importance of emotional intelligence. All of us have different kind of ways that we are intelligent depending upon our own kind of mental makeup. And one of them is to have that degree of emotional intelligence and awareness so that when those feelings arise, particularly the mind of anger that induces this 6 second flushing of the chemicals throughout our body, that we recognize that after that, it's a choice. Do we really continue and further that? Or do we put it and kind of nip it in the bud right there? So again, let me just check in to see, these are just more tools I'm giving you around how to approach everything else I'm going to talk about tonight and the remaining 2 sessions. Anything anyone needed to share?
It would be so helpful to me if you could relate it to your experience.
Yeah, I mean, again, trying to think of a particular situation, but certainly, I can talk about when I first encountered some of these teachings. Not that I'm saying I'm a perfect driver now, but I was driving in the Bay Area, going to the center in San Francisco, and I started learning a bit about how to work with anger. And of course, begin to go to the teachings, meditate on things, and try to apply it because I saw what was happening, at least in my driving in the Bay Area, was that I was getting really angry and upset an awful lot of the time. Because of the way people were driving and, cutting me off here or doing this or that. And so it became a matter of, again, being able to apply an awareness of when that is arising. So that you begin to see, okay, there's that initial point, that's that first arrow, right? That first sensation of mental unhappiness, or I mean, or physical unhappiness in the case of some of these. But that first arrow just kind of brings that unpleasant sensation in. So I was, trying to get to that point. Of course, initially I couldn't get to that point because that was happening and I was going into my autopilot almost immediately so that I would then start seeing my own anger arising and me reacting to it often with, flipping the bird or doing whatever, It's hard to maybe think of me doing that, but I've done it, many times. So again, what I was finding initially was that I was catching it after the fact. I'd go through all of this and I'd go, wow, I just did it again. That's great. That's already wonderful because you're at least seeing at some point having a mindful awareness of what has transpired. It's more past oriented than it is present oriented, but it's nonetheless kind of catching it at some stage of the game. Well, what I was finding then is that I was getting it kind of closer in and closer in and closer in. I mean, I don't know if I've ever got it to the point where I just had just the first arrow with no second arrow thoughts, because I think that's really advanced to be at that level, where you're not having any kind of mental reaction to it that's harmful, and only having moments of, peace and tranquility or whatever, and loving kindness and compassion towards every being who cuts you off on the road. But nonetheless, I think I'm much closer to that now than I was certainly, in my initial practice in San Francisco. Of course, then I went to Italy and I didn't drive for many, many years, and so I kind of cut that out. When I came back to Santa Fe, I was like, okay, I need to kind of,
You didn't have it in Italy because you don't drive in it. You didn't.
yes,
have
I
it.
wasn't. I mean, but that was at least one area where I didn't see it. It's not that I was free of anger in all my other interactions with other beings. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that in terms of this particular example, it's something that if you do get into a habit where you are practicing it when you are experiencing that, you do become much more adept. And of course, it will spill over into other things. Hopefully, it's not just, okay, I've got my driving mind to practice and then my, grocery shopping mind to practice and whatever. I mean, that you essentially need, to kind of bring it into all of your activities. And that's what the course is also to help you to do. And I think I'm a much more patient person now, certainly, than when I look at back on myself, and that was like 30 years ago, right? 30 years. I mean, a lot of people go, well, yeah, 30 years, but 30 years is minuscule compared to the amount of time we've had anger in our minds, which of course is without any beginning. So we're talking about infinitesimal numbers of years and lifetimes that we've had anger in our mind. So do your best on these techniques. That's the other thing I might mention at this stage is don't think that just, a few bits of meditation on this and suddenly your anger is totally under control and you're going to be patient in every situation. You can be eventually.
I think that's a key point.
Yeah, but don't beat yourself up if you're not. Did I share the story of the roundabouts and the guy driving? I've shared this before. One student I work with, and he gave me permission to share this story, but he was working on his anger issues. And in Santa Fe, there's these roundabouts out by the community college. And they put them in, and I don't know if are there any in Taos? Do you have any roundabouts? Well, you must. I know where they are. They're over by the hospital, aren't they? Yeah, yeah. So anyway, you get to that roundabout, and he got there, and there was another car coming, and he probably had time to pull in front of them, but he decided to let them come. Well, the person behind him didn't like that decision, or at least that's the way they expressed, that he thought was what was behind it. He started honking on their horn like, move, move. And so he looks in the rearview mirror and he goes like this, getting ready to extend his middle finger, but he didn't. And when he told me the story, I was like, congratulations, that's great. You stopped your middle finger. I don't know what the driver behind him thought this was. Maybe, yeah, something, yeah, right on. I don't know. Or maybe the person imagined a middle finger anyway because they'd gotten middle fingers enough, but who knows? But the idea is that we have to stop it wherever we can. And for some of us, like I said, my initial thing was I was noticing it after the fact. I was like, I stepped it in again. But it's good not to self-flagellate at that point and go, oh, I'm a miserable Buddhist practitioner. Oh, I'm horrible. I can't meditate. I can't practice. I mean, what's the point of that? That's just,
We have a lot of reason to be angry about traffic here. house.
And
Because of the construction.
yeah, there's construction. Yeah. But I mean, there's also growing populations. I think Taos is doing a better job of containing population growth than Santa Fe, perhaps. But in Santa Fe, I mean, there's population's growing quite a bit.
Mm.
I would say probably we've gone up at least by a quarter to a third in population in the last 5, 6 years, so you have to have your patience hat on. You have to be able to practice these things. So again, I always encourage, and we were now while we're on the subject of kind of how to work with these, is choose what is something you're comfortable working with. It might not be like the huge item, but though there is benefit if that is what you work with, because if you work with the really big one, the littler ones will be probably much easier to work with. Nonetheless, if you're feeling like you're a little low in self-confidence, then maybe start with one that's in the middle or in the lower range, and then have some successes there, and then you'll be able to tackle the greater and greater ones. You choose what works best for you, but try to gain some successes, if you will, but not be too hard on yourself if you have 3 successes and then a failure, and then it's going to be like that. That's the nature of changing our minds. None of these beings who are the examples of this, like, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, incredibly patient, incredibly compassionate, incredibly kind. He didn't get that way, like, without practice. That's how we all get there. That's what they're constantly telling us. And of course, this idea of thinking long term, thinking, I just have to keep doing the work. One time I was teaching, and this one person said, we have that saying, practice makes perfect. And this person said, in my estimation, practice makes practice. And that's really what happens. You practice and it just makes more practice. It makes more practice. We just keep practicing. There is a perfect, though the perfect is way down the road, but we don't need to be concerned with the perfect yet. Just keep doing the practice. Any other comments? Thanks for that, Anne-Marie. Let's go ahead and go back then to the section where we're going to look at this technique of observing anger. I'm not going to talk about this so much, but I think it is definitely a product, once more, of the degree to which we have some mindfulness. So it says here in this first paragraph, however, what I've highlighted, however, although the word meditation is used, we do not need to sit with legs crossed and closed eyes to familiarize ourselves with the techniques in this book. Again, in this course, because I'm drawing a lot of these from her work, but also additional things I've added in here and there. We can simply lean back in a comfortable chair and reflect. The meditation of observing our anger involves sitting quietly and, instead of paying attention to the storyline behind the anger, simply noting the various physical and mental sensations that arise and pass as the anger flows through us. We may note the emotional pain of hurt feelings, disappointment, unfulfilled expectations, simply observing these, but not reacting to them by clinging to them or pushing them away. We experience them as they are in the present. In doing so, we watch them arise and cease of their own accord. Now, this is, again, a technique that can eventually be brought to bear in the moment when we are experiencing that first arrow and the second arrow starts to develop. We go, okay, I'm going to not follow the storyline and the normal stuff that I start feeding my mind with that makes it into this huge cataclysmic event. I'm going to just look at what is going on here. What am I feeling? What is happening? Being more of an observer. Again, as I said earlier, it's being kind of that objective perspective on what's happening in your mind subjectively. You're not going to take the subjective role, because then that's going to probably cause you to do all of that ruminating and so on. Instead, you're going to look at it objectively and see what is occurring. We're going to break this down into kind of 3 different things that we do in the midst of that, or as part of that process. Let me carry on with, get down just a little bit. There's an interesting quote here that she says about a hospice nurse once commented to vulnerable children that she has noticed that even if people try, they cannot sustain a negative emotion for very long. I find that interesting because I think you can actually sustain them for a fairly long time, but nonetheless, if we observe closely, she says in that highlighted section, we can even note our emotions and thoughts changing moment by moment. Such mindfulness can be very effective in letting go of negative emotions. Again, sometimes we do notice that there's a very profound shift in the kind of content from like the initial first arrow piercing to some period down the road. It might even be just a few seconds, could be a few minutes. that the sting isn't quite as strong. But if we aren't observing that, then we're simply going to, again, use our thought processes to go down that pathway of anger. Kind of going into that role of observer, you can actually see what's going on and see the changes that are occurring. Okay, that's the end of it. But what I wanted to point out when we're talking about this, let me get to my notes here and make sure that I'm pointing out the right sections. That first part of this paragraph that's highlighted, that's towards the top there, this kind of sitting quietly and attending to the story, not getting involved in the storyline, instead attending to what is happening, just observing it. This is what I'm calling in my practice thing awareness. And you first have to just simply be aware of what is going on, as opposed to being again involved in it and kind of working with it through this process of the second arrow stuff, through our kind of forming thoughts and opinions about what's happening and so on. That storyline stuff is not what we want to pay attention to at all. We want to become aware of what is happening, moving it there. Now, again, if you can't do that in the moment, which again takes some skill and ability, then as she's saying there, you kind of look it over in your meditation in the evening. So say you have this really kind of difficult experience with somebody earlier in the day. Maybe you do have time during the day to find a quiet place and reflect. But at least by some time later that day, you should be able to bring it into your meditation, into your reflection, and take a look at it, become aware of what was all going on. And try to do it relatively soon afterwards so that you do have the recollection that's pretty fresh. You're not trying to recreate the experience of that first arrow in your mind. You're simply trying to be aware of what transpired. What was going on emotionally, and what was I feeling at the various levels after the initial piercing of that first arrow, the thoughts that followed, and so on, all of the various sensations. Then the second part of it is kind of in the bottom of that paragraph where it says simply observing these, but not reacting to them by clinging to them or pushing them away and so on. That's what I'm calling waiting. Waiting is an important part of it. We have to be kind of able to wait. It's kind of interesting that we often would get that advice from our parents, right? About being patient means being able to wait. Just wait, just be patient. Just, it'll come. That's the idea here, is that we want to kind of wait and not have that immediacy of needing to react or respond even. The idea is that by kind of sitting there and being with the emotions, there actually is some shift and some change in those. And that's what's pointed out in that last paragraph that we looked at. So how I put this together into a practice, and then of course it leads to the third step, which is what I call, reframing, which we've already talked about, is to essentially think about other thoughts that you could introduce that would be more beneficial at that time. So again, as I'm saying in the instructions here, and I do like going through these because I think it gives a way of recapping what I've already talked about in the last, half hour or so. Take some quiet time to sit and reflect upon one or more of your own past episodes of anger. And hopefully it's something, again, that was fairly recent where you have a recollection that's fairly fresh. Ask yourself the following questions in order to first increase your awareness of the sensations that arise as you experience the spectrum of anger. Kind of notice what's going on. Secondly, develop the ability to wait to respond appropriately. Because, of course, if we wait, oftentimes, again, there's a shift, there's a change. Things are not as fresh as when that first arrow just pierced you. And we're going to get into another little thing where we examine things from a longer perspective. But nonetheless, even in the perspective of some seconds or minutes, things already do begin to change. The third is explore the potential to reframe the situation through changing your thoughts at that time. Then when you encounter something that could trigger your anger, notice when you are able to hold that awareness of what's happening, to wait to respond rather than habitually reacting, and also to eventually consider that it's possible to reframe your thoughts so you can consequently respond with more beneficial words and action. You might notice that I try to use these words react and respond in kind of opposing ways. And I don't know that it's technically not the way they're used in English, but I like the concept of react, right? React. I keep reacting. And so that's what our habitual mind does of anger, right? It keeps reacting, saying the same storyline, the same way of confronting that and dealing with that. responding, of course, it's just the root word for responsibility. It's like I'm going to be responsible in the moment and respond effectively. So I always try to use respond as the healthier way of addressing what is going on. Because again, under no conditions are you told that you shouldn't be doing something in response to what's happening in the world around you. It's rather, how are you doing that? If you're simply reacting with anger and recycling that, well, that's going to produce its own kind of energy that's not so healthy for us. If we respond more effectively, then we're doing it from a safer place, a more sound place that is grounded in these thoughts that we're introducing here. Eventually, we're going to get to, using love and compassion towards others as the basis for how we respond. But if we don't have those, if we can't distinguish those two, essentially, then we're just going to continue to follow the habitual pattern. So that's why I do it in that way. I'm not going to go into all these questions that are here, but nonetheless, I've divided it into 3 sections then. Increasing the habit of awareness. So again, just go back to that situation. When did you first recognize that anger was being triggered? What physical and mental sensations arose at that time? Kind of recalling that. And it's not to have the subjective experience of that, it's the objective observation of that, right? Is everyone clear on that? I mean, again, it's kind of hard to differentiate those because it's you looking at your own mind. But nonetheless, that's the role you want to take. It's like, I'm kind of a scientist investigating what's going on in my mind. And I want to see what are the different steps that are occurring. Third, can you detect with more precision how the feelings of hurt and anger changed throughout that episode? So again, see that initially what happened in that first hearing those words or whatever the case was, and then how over time there was already some sort of shift or change. And then fourth, at any point during the episode, was there also present a desire to change your mind or do something different? I think that is important. We have to begin to introduce that impulse. That was kind of, again, when I go back to the example that Anne-Marie asked me to share about, working with driving. If you don't keep having the impulse of like, I want to do something different, well, then you're not going to do anything different, right? That's a very important impulse that we often kind of forget. You have to introduce that and sustain that and have that be more top of mind than the reaction that is more habitual. The desire to do something different, desire to change your mind. So again, just look back and again, don't beat yourself up if you went through the whole episode and there was never a thought about, oh, this is one of those instances where I should be changing my mind and looking at things differently. That's okay. That's how it starts. But at least to be able to begin to introduce that so that when we have that initial first arrow thing, almost the more immediate thing would be, oh, this is something that would habitually bring up my anger. I'm going to use this as a doorway for something else, for a deeper understanding of the nature of samsara, or for developing love and compassion for beings who harm me. Okay. So that's an important part of that. And again, I keep saying that I'm not going to go through all these points and then I go through them all, but nonetheless, you guys are all used to me. So develop the habit of waiting. What would it have been like for you to step back, breathe, and simply wait to respond to your feelings? Are there any techniques you found that inspire you to avoid your immediate reaction and to wait before responding to a situation? Some people, I remember hearing this as a kid, count to 10. There's something beneficial in counting to 10 or maybe count to 100. That might be a better one. You'll be there for a while. But the idea is that, there can be sometimes these additional techniques that help us to wait. We are in very much a society that almost like expects that people are going to immediately react to everything. It's the pace of our culture, right? Just, things happening so quickly. So we have to be able to wait. We have to be able to kind of sit with things and not, because they will change over time, as was said earlier. You can see that happens, but also we're going to be in a different place. Then exploring the habit of reframing. And again, this is mostly what we're going to work with for the rest of this course as well. Can you see that in that episode, you had the potential to choose to see things differently and to change your response? That you actually could do something different. And second, looking back on that episode, how could you reframe things now so that your anger might be lessened or avoided? And again, that's what we're going to be introducing in terms of some of these techniques to reframe, to look at things differently. On those occasions when you have been able to change your thoughts when anger arose, what happened? What did you think and how did you act then? Okay. All right, so let's go on then to the next section. This is a rather long section, actually. Let me go back to the outline. The outline has kind of recollecting and accepting the nature of things. And secondly, recognizing that our control of situations is limited. And there's a number of kind of points within these. We talk about the nature of things. We're not talking about the deeper investigation into the ultimate nature of things. That's the final point on emptiness. Here we're just talking about that it's in the nature of us to have problems and difficulties, for there to be first arrows. I already touched on that when we talked about the first arrow, but nonetheless, this is a key part of it. So I've divided this into a number of sections. The first one has to do with regarding accepting situations, the acceptance of what's going on in our life at any particular time. Venerable Children says, underneath our anger, we often find a refusal to accept the reality of a situation and a feeling of powerlessness in its face. This is something we're going to touch on as well in a little bit, this lack of control over situations. These feelings are related because the confusion that arises from fighting the reality of an event makes us feel helpless and unable to influence it. Once we accept what is happening, we can then determine more clearly the parameters of possible action and feel empowered to act. I talked about this a little bit earlier, right? That we have actually this, kind of what was I talking about? Sorry, just had this wonderful thought come into my head and then it just disappeared. Confusion makes me feel helpless. Well, let's go back to what's on the screen there. So the idea here is that if we don't accept a situation, if we don't actually take for, kind of welcome it in, that was what Thich Nhat Hanh was saying earlier, right? That we kind of, say, okay, you're coming in, let's see what you have to teach me. If we don't kind of accept it, we don't have really a variety of ways to respond effectively. So accepting the situation as what is happening to us is an important step in the process. She goes on to say, often we become angry because we think that someone shouldn't think, do, or say what they are, or that things shouldn't happen the way that they are. In other words, our mind does not accept the reality of whatever is happening and wants it to be different. We may develop many reasons why things should be different, but that doesn't change the reality of what they are. So again, acceptance is an important part of it. And I want to clarify because sometimes we have this idea of acceptance once more means that we then don't do anything about the situation. That's not what we're saying here. Acceptance is the first step of saying, okay, this is going on. I have to accept that this is going on rather than resisting it, denying it. There's that Calvin and Hobbes cartoon, the one thing I've shared it in another teaching where Calvin is saying, it's not denial. I'm just very selective about the reality I accept. So we have to be able to invite in that as reality. Okay, what is going on? I have to accept that this is a conflict in my life right now, that something is occurring, that this, again, first arrow experience is happening. If I go into denial or if I go into some sort of resistance to it, then once more, I'm not going to be able to move on from that. I'm not going to be able to actually, again, engage in the process of reframing and so on. So that's what Venerable Children also goes into in this next section here, where she talks about some people think that, let me get the cursor in the right place here. No, that's not where it needs to be. Go away. You can all see me fiddling with my screen with the TV here in the Gompa. So acceptance, doesn't mean that we don't try to change the situation and so on. As is highlighted there, acceptance simply means fully accepting that what is happening now is indeed happening, even if we do not like what it is. We stop fighting the reality of the present moment and let go of our anger. Nevertheless, we can still aspire and work towards improving the situation in the future. In fact, acceptance of the present enables us to think more clearly about effective means for influencing what occurs in the future. Right? In other words, we let go of that habitual reaction and we actually think about how we would more helpfully and healthily respond. There's that wonderful quote that I was alluding to a little bit earlier. It's got two parts to it from Shantideva in his 6th chapter of the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, the chapter on patience. Why be unhappy about something if it can be remedied? Right? If you can do something about it, well, then all that kind of second arrow stuff is pointless because it's just torturing yourself. right? If you can do something about it, well, that's happened, okay, somebody rams into your car, well, you can still do something about that, right? You can get the driver's information and their insurance and get the car fixed and everything. It's not, the end of the world, right? Secondly, and what is the use of being unhappy about something if it cannot be remedied? We do occasionally encounter some things that we can't change, right? That cannot be affected by whatever we do. We have to deal with that reality. But our second arrow stuff in that case is really pointless because that's only, you can't do anything about it. It's only going to, again, cause more mental torture to ourselves. So again, whether we waste our times by being unhappy, worried, having anger, what have you, or whether it's actually futile because we can't do anything about the situation. Acceptance is a part of that. It's like I have to accept that this is actually what's going on. And with the second one in particular, there are a lot of things we simply have to accept as a part of the nature of reality. You can rail against all kinds of quote, injustices and harm and whatever is happening to you. But the reality is that that's what it means to be an embodied being in this world, to be a human being having a human life. We all have to experience grief and loss and anger and upset and all these things because that is part of the human existence. Whether we choose to, again, have that initial arrow and just experience that and accept it, or whether we choose to create a whole scenario on top of that, that's entirely in our own court. But it begins with, again, having some level of acceptance. Regarding the acceptance of change and impermanence, it's kind of interesting. This is one of the, of course, main teachings that the Buddha gave is on the idea of things constantly changing. But he points out that we tend to cling to the opposite. We really are very fixated on things remaining the same and not changing. And look at the pandemic and what happened there, where suddenly we all had to change our lives pretty drastically, right? Because of what was going on in our world. So Venerable Children starts in her little section on this. Although change is universal, we typically know this only intellectually. For example, we understand that our relationships are impermanent by their very nature. Everything that arises also changes. Thus, from the very beginning, any relationship by its nature is bound to change. There's no way around this. Yet, unless we deeply accept this, we will be surprised when it does so. I mean, I'm always very amazed. I mean, I guess I've had pretty good fortune with long relationships in my life, but I am still amazed that people can stay together for so long when we're constantly changing, right? And the world around us is constantly changing. And whatever initial sort of attraction that caused two people to come into a more intimate relationship, there's nothing, again, guaranteed about that that's going to be sustained over time. We are all subject to change. And of course, again, our clinging to things as if they're not going to change becomes a source of great, difficulty for us, a lot of frustration for us. Do you need to get going, Mary Jo? I'm concerned about you with the light changing out there.
Yes.
Okay, but anyway, yes, thanks for coming and for
Yes.
being here, and
Very
drive safe. Hope you get back to where
very
you need to.
important in my life.
I understand. Yes, no, I understand completely, but I'm glad you were able to be here for this. So, yes. So then I have a passage from Venerable Children's, another one of her books. It's really quite nice, more of an introduction to Buddhism, but she talks about that kind of meditation on impermanence involves recollecting that all the people, objects, and situations change each moment. They don't stay the same. Remembering impermanence helps us to avoid exaggerating the importance of what happens to us. And that gets played out in terms of this final thing in that section on accepting change and impermanence and the role of that. This comes from Practicing Emotional Intelligence by Joshua Friedman. He says, try creating a 5-year flashback. Imagine you're looking back on this moment. So say you have something happening, and this might be something that happened today, that might have incited some feelings of mental discomfort or physical discomfort. Say you're looking back on this moment from 5 years in the future. What are the options your future self can see? Which of those options will contribute to something that still matters in 5 years? By practicing this reflection, you'll build the muscle of taking perspective. You'll find that you're better able to recognize the small stuff. We always say, let go of the small stuff, right? Pay no attention to the small stuff. This will give you space to focus your energy and attention on what's more important to you and to our shared future. So the idea here is that when we kind of introduce into all of this the understanding of impermanence, that we're constantly dealing with things changing every moment, sometimes significantly, sometimes not as significantly, but they always change. Was what DT Suzuki, Suzuki Roshi, he told his group of students once, this is according to Louis Richmond, said he was doing all these, very intricate teachings, and then somebody in the room raised their hand and said, Roshi, haven't understood a word of what you said. Can you tell us something that we can all get? And Roshi said, everything changes. Those two words, right? But that's a very powerful thing, because if we can apply that, an acceptance of that in the moment, kind of accept that this is something that will change. What was that phrase? This too shall pass. My mother would often, use that. I think it's used more in the theistic traditions, right? This too shall pass. This is not going to last forever. Nothing lasts forever. Our experiences are fleeting and transitory. So even have that kind of understanding, accepting what is going on, but bringing into the understanding that we also gain some appreciation for in the waiting phase of that previous topic, that if we examine it from a longer term perspective, things are definitely going to change. 5 years from now, is that particular situation that is occurring to you even something you'll remember, much less something that you have the heat about that you do in that moment? Oftentimes we are very reactive to that moment, thinking that it is kind of the be all and end all of our existence, not seeing that over time that's going to change and diminish. Just that can also be very liberating, okay? So that's another level of acceptance, accepting that things are happening, also accepting the change and the impermanence of that situation. Now, here's where we get into more of the Buddhist teachings around just the nature of what we call samsara, right? She says it is helpful to recognize that being let down is part of the very nature of cyclic existence, samsara. Suffering and disappointment are bound to happen. Why? Because we're under the influence of our disturbing attitudes, our negative emotions, and our karma. Remember, in the Four Noble Truths teachings, these are essentially what the Buddha pointed out as the source of all of our suffering, is that we have, especially the more active affliction of desire that is craving for things to be the way we want them to be. But of course, when we get thwarted, then that's when anger arises. And of course, all of that is rooted in our ignorance. And we have all these different iterations of other afflictive emotions. And those cause us to act, to create karma. And that karma ripens into our experiences, good, bad, or indifferent. Essentially, all of this is arising through the process of the causes of our dukkha, the first noble truth, the dissatisfaction that we are dealing with. So if that's the case, if the Buddha right from the beginning said, guess what, it's not such a wonderful ride that we're on. That's what actually dukkha means literally. It's kind of a bumpy ride. Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride. And then, we become aware through the second noble truth, the causes of that. Well, as long as those causes are around, we're going to have dukkha. We're going to have suffering in its different manifestations. So then it says, being aware of the nature of cyclic existence in this way will propel us to eliminate its causes by practicing the Dharma. So again, why would what it comes down to essentially, to put it in kind of basic facts, what is arising at that moment, that first arrow stuff, again, keep using that throughout this course because I think it's a really useful tool to talk about it. That first arrow stuff that is happening is a ripening of our past karma that has been negative, that we've created through the force of our own delusions, our afflictions. Having somebody yell at you or have loud music or whatever is because of your own insensitivity to disturbing the minds of others. And you've done that many, many times, and it's coming back home to roost, essentially. Well, then why would you react in a similar way if you're concerned about your future experiences? It doesn't make sense. It's not logical for me to keep doing the same thing that got me into the situation in the first place. It's that old adage once more that, I don't know, somebody attributed it to Ben Franklin, but I don't know if Ben came up with this or not. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. This is what samsara essentially is. We keep doing the same thing again and again and again, and we don't see through it to see that it's only going to lead us to the same result, that we're only going to have more anger, more delusion and what have you. So if we don't, have some attention to this process whereby we are creating first arrows all the time whenever we follow those minds, well, then we're going to just keep doing the same thing. We're going to have more first arrows, more suffering experiences. So that's the idea behind this, is that we have to have some awareness that this is the nature of samsara. And furthermore, we don't really want to keep experiencing that. Then the other side of it, which I think is really worthwhile, it says in that second paragraph, meanwhile, we can recognize that others are under the influence of their disturbing attitudes and negative emotions, just as we are. Why should we expect ordinary sentient beings similar to ourselves to be continuously kind and clear in their motivation and actions? They, as we, are frequently overpowered by prejudice, misjudgment, fear, and greed. When they do or say things that hurt us, they are doing so because they are unhappy. So I'm going to leave it here and we'll go into the remaining points in this section. But let me go to the practice one for this, because I think it's really quite nice in terms of, helping us to look at these different points that we've already talked about tonight. So again, when you are experiencing something that gets you upset, ask yourself the following questions. And of course, do this in your meditation beforehand, just as Venerable Chodron advised in what I shared with you earlier tonight. Examine the reality of the situation. Can you accept and see clearly what is happening? Is it something you can change? As Master Shantideva says, well, then what would you do to facilitate that change rather than getting stuck? And then third, if it's something you cannot change, can you see the uselessness in becoming agitated and simply let it go by relaxing the mind, by saying, okay, I just have to accept this. The second part, change and impermanence. At this moment, are you being taken off guard because of not being aware of the fact that everything changes and that your expectations to the contrary aren't in line with reality? In terms of what you are experiencing and how you are feeling, are you exaggerating the importance of what is happening to you at this moment? Again, putting so much attention on that present moment and that uncomfortable first arrow that you are not aware of the fact that things are going to change, that in 5 years, again, it would be a very different perspective than it is in this moment. Third, does it help lessen your anger by saying that the situation is going to change and that in hours, days, months, or years, it might even seem quite insignificant? And then seeing the nature of existence, what I just went through. To what extent have you accepted that having problems such as this and being let down are part of life, that they are part of the human condition? Are you and your situation really that different from other people and what they experience? I don't like using this as often necessarily, because I think we do have to kind of honor that people are going through a difficult time. But nonetheless, we do have to kind of bring our own situation into the perspective that we're not alone in our suffering. I don't want you to get into a comparison thing. Oh, their suffering is so much worse than mine or whatever. It is nice sometimes to have that awareness. But I think the most important thing is just see that it's not really different. We all are subject to these types of sufferings. And then for the final one here in this section, if others are involved in your situation, are you expecting them to behave in ways that are beyond their capability? Can you see that they might be overpowered by their own negative emotions, just like you? I think that's a big one. Again, not all of our situations of having anger arise involve another person. But if we can hold that awareness that that person in front of us, I sometimes use this phrase, and I've never heard any of my Tibetan teachers say this, but that person in front of us is essentially doing the best that they can. And that's a good thing to apply to ourselves too. I mean, in the moment, if we're not able to have a more patient mind and we actually have anger arising again, well, we're doing the best that we can. But I put a footnote to that. And with time and effort and so on, we can do better. Because that's the important thing to remember. That's why we're all here, because we don't want to just resign and put our hands up and say, oh, well, I'm just doing the best that I can. I'm just doing the best that I can. You can do better. You can improve your mind and you can improve your behavior. But it takes time, it takes effort, it takes all those other things. But nonetheless, anyone that we meet, most of the people that we meet probably don't even have any of this awareness or skills, right? Look at how hard it is for us as Buddhist practitioners to practice this way. Even if they do have those skills, they might be struggling with applying them in their own lives, right? So they say and do things that hurt other people like us. So why are we so surprised? Why are we so taken aback when others don't behave in this absolutely miraculous way? Okay, so that's the important one in there, I think, in many ways, because if we hold that awareness, we're already moving in the direction of love and compassion for that person. because we see that they're a being just like us who's under the control of their crazy states of mind and reacting in these unhealthy ways and doing things that they regret. I mean, how horrible. They're doing the same thing I'm doing. You know, we can at least have that identification with another, which is the bridge of empathy that then we can build compassion and love on. If we are able to see that the people on the other side of the political fence or whatever the case might be are exactly like us in many different ways, you know, especially this way we're talking about here right now, well, then we have a greater understanding and a lot less resistance and anger towards them. So any comments to conclude tonight? We're already at 7:30, sorry, but the time goes so quickly when we're having fun, right? Okay. Any comments? Again, now what I'm encouraging you to do is to work with these, and then you don't have to work with all of them, because I know we've only got like a week between these. I'm introducing these to you and giving you the readings and all of this, the little sheets so that you can work with them over time. But if there's something tonight that you go, wow, that kind of sparks an interest for me, that's something I think I could work with. And maybe it's just, you know, the using a little bit more mindfulness in the moment. Maybe it's, you know, doing the technique of observing anger. Maybe it's one of these we've looked at of accepting the situation, you know, looking at the nature of things in terms of the different points we've raised. We haven't gone beyond that third one, so maybe it might not be, you know, best to go beyond that in terms of your practice, but work with any of those, any one of those if you, you know, don't want to do multiple ones over the next week and see what happens. You know, it's a laboratory. We're not going to, you know, don't expect, you know, miraculous results again, but expect simply that you're going to do the practice and do the practice as best as you can. You know? Don't beat yourself up if you don't get the results that you would ideally like to see, because that's going to take time. Okay, then let's go ahead and conclude tonight with our dedications. And Jana's going to first read the list for the prayers that we're making by dedicating tonight.
We dedicate the merit created by listening to the teaching tonight to all beings everywhere on every prayer list. We also dedicate her those experiencing obstacles: John, Mary Jo, Matt, Jeff Cochran, Antoine, Martin, Ida, Maybon, Wyatt, Jana. For illness: Bill, Patty, Rolf, Taryn A, Yolanda, Jane, Dorcas, Jill, Michon, BL Westover, Steve Handlos, Kendra.
Okay, that first one
Oh, yeah.
had pancreatic cancer was just diagnosed,
Oh,
and the second one, breast cancer.
Breast
she was just
cancer.
diagnosed, it came back again.
is it Toth? Kendra Toth?
Kendra,
And the last name Toth? Okay. And for those who have died recently or who are in the process of dying: Lori, Simon Tate, Kate Lockwood, Ella Mexican Wolf, Gray Wolf, Connie, Mona Lee, Adam, Muhammad, Monica Silvers, Emily Pike, Latai Tonga, Ali Rasmussen, Jesus Quintanilla, Zoe Holland, and David Durant.
Can you add Connie Paprika to the just recently died?
Connie Paprika.
Yes.
Okay.
And could you add Mike Flood?
Is to death.
So again, for those beings whose names were on the list, as well as any others that we have offered to pray for, that we've been asked to pray for, we dedicate now for their ultimate welfare. Let's go ahead and do the dedication prayers. And Jana, you'll do the honors again. I've got to pull up the other file and get to the right page. Okay, there we go.
Dedication prayers, once in Tibetan. Gewadi
No, do, da, lama, sa, do, yo, do, wa, chi, kyan, mahalupa, Dehi, sa, Sho.
Sem
Sem Chogrin Poche. Ma ke Panam ke Gyurchik. Ke Wanyam Pa Me Payam. Gong Ne Gong Du Pelwar Sho.
Long life prayers for His Holiness Dalai Lama. The wish
Granting wish fulfilling jewel,
source
source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. So I haven't received the specific advice around what to do with now. And some of you may know Lama Zopa Rinpoche, our spiritual director, passed away just about 2 years ago. April 13th, coming up this Sunday, is the 2-year anniversary of that. And they just announced in the last week that His Holiness the Dalai Lama has said that his reincarnation has happened, that there's a young child in Nepal somewhere who is the continuity of Rinpoche's presence in this world. So we're no longer making prayers for the swift return because he's swiftly returned. So, but I think maybe what I'll prepare for next week is we'll do just a couple of Miksemas, which is the prayer that they've been asking us to do, as well as the chanting the names of Manjushri. So everything be auspicious for him to be found, the young girl or boy, whoever it is, who is the reincarnation of Rinpoche. And then, of course, everything happen in an auspicious way for him or her to be able to help sentient beings as much as possible through their presence in this world. So maybe we just make those thoughts, dedicating for everything to be auspicious for the continuation of this process of Rinpoche reappearing in this world to benefit us and all beings. And that should do it for tonight. So thank you, Jana, for we didn't do the prayer for Usul, but I don't know, do we need to do that? I haven't been doing that. Okay. Well, we can have nice thoughts towards Usul. Usul is the reincarnation of Lama Yeshe. So anything else for tonight? So practice well as best as you can. Don't beat yourself up if you don't do that well. Again, takes time. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Eloise and Adrienne.
Thank you.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you.
Thank
you, Don.
very much.
All right, be
Thank
well.